A beautiful woman is sitting next to a teenage boy on a flight when the plane suddenly hits severe turbulence. Moments later, the aircraft goes into a terrifying nosedive. The captain's voice crackles over the intercom. "Folks, I hate to say this, but we might not walk away from this one." Panic spreads through the cabin, except for the teenage boy, who sheepishly turns to the woman and says, "Miss, I don't mean to trouble you, but if we're about to die, I've never kissed anyone." The woman is taken aback, but seeing the fear in his eyes, decides to grant him this final wish. She leans in and gives him a passionate kiss. The boy, now emboldened, stammers, "That was amazing, but I've also never felt a woman's—" She hesitates, but then sighs, "Oh, what the hell?" and guides his hand under her shirt. Moments later, flushed and exhilarated, he nervously asks, "You've been so kind already. But I don't want to die a virgin." The woman, caught up in the moment, nods with a smile and starts undoing his belt. Just then, the plane levels out. Relieved passengers cheer as they land safely. As the woman exits, she shakes the captain's hand and says, "Thank you for saving us from certain death." The boy follows behind, pats the captain on the back, and mutters, "Next time, Dad, just give it a little longer." Matt and his wife lived in the countryside. Matt was notoriously stingy and hated spending money. One day, a fair came to the nearby town. "Let's go to the fair, Matt," his wife said. "We haven't been anywhere in ages." Matt frowned. He knew a fair meant spending money. After thinking it over, he finally sighed. "All right, but we're not wasting a cent. We'll look, but we're not buying anything." At the fair, they wandered past the stalls, admiring all the attractions. His wife pointed out several things she wanted, but Matt refused to spend a dime. Then, in a nearby field, they spotted an old biplane with a sign, "Fun flight, $20 for 10 minutes. Matt had never been on a plane before and wanted to try it, but he wasn't about to pay for 2 tickets. "I've only got $20, he told the pilot. "Can my wife ride for free?" The pilot, struggling to sell tickets, thought for a moment and said, "Tell you what, I'll make you a deal. If neither of you screams or shouts during the flight, you won't have to pay for her." Matt agreed, and they climbed aboard. The pilot took off and did every trick in the book, dives, loops, rolls, sharp turns, trying to make them scream. But Matt and his wife stayed silent. After an intense flight, the pilot finally gave up. "All right, you win," he said. "You didn't make a sound, so the ride's free." Matt wiped his brow. "Thanks, wasn't easy, especially when she fell out." A jumbo jet is on its final approach into Toronto Pearson Airport. The captain comes over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're on our final descent into Toronto. I'd like to thank you for flying with us today, and I hope you enjoy your stay." But then, he forgets to switch off the intercom. Now the entire cabin can hear his private conversation with the co-pilot. "So, Skipper, what's the plan once we land?" asks the co-pilot. The captain chuckles. "Well, first, I'm going to check into the hotel and take a big crap. Then I'm taking that new stewardess with the huge tits out for dinner. After that, I'm going to wine and dine her, bring her back to my room, and give it to her all night long." The whole plane falls silent. Passengers start craning their necks, eagerly looking up and down the aisle for the new stewardess. At the very back of the plane, the young stewardess turns beet red. Mortified, she takes off running toward the cockpit to turn off the intercom. Halfway down the aisle, she trips over an old lady's bag and lands flat on her face. The old lady leans over, pats her on the arm, and says, "No rush, dear. He's got to use the bathroom first." A photographer from a well-known national magazine was assigned to cover the wildfires at Yellowstone National Park. The magazine wanted dramatic shots of firefighters battling the blaze. When the photographer arrived, he quickly realized the thick smoke made ground-level photos impossible. He requested a plane to get aerial shots, and his request was approved. He was instructed to go to a nearby airport where a small plane would be waiting. Rushing to the airstrip, he saw a plane warming up near the gate. Without hesitation, he jumped in with his gear and shouted, "Let's go!" The pilot taxied onto the runway, took off, and soon they were soaring over the park. "Fly low over the fire and make a few passes so I can get some shots," the photographer instructed. The pilot hesitated. "Why?" "Because I'm a photographer." he replied impatiently. "And photographers take photographs." There was a long silence. Then in a shaky voice, the pilot asked, "Wait, you mean you're not the flight instructor?" A flight crew is landing at an unfamiliar airport. As they begin their approach, the pilot squints at the runway ahead. "Does that runway look kind of short to you?" he asks. "Sure does," the co-pilot replies. "I thought it was supposed to be longer than that." "Me too." "All right, better set full flaps. Full flaps set. I want thrust reversers the second we touch down. Standing by, and full power once they engage." "Roger that. I'm going to try to hit the very edge of the runway and stand on the brakes. Ready? Ready." They touch down hard, blast the thrust reversers, and stomp the brakes with everything they've got. The plane screeches to a stop just inches from the grass. The pilot wipes his forehead. "Good Lord, that's the shortest runway I've ever landed on." The co-pilot looks around and mutters, "Yeah, but look how wide it is." An old man, a schoolboy, a lawyer, a doctor, and a social worker are on a small plane when suddenly the pilot suffers a stroke and dies. The plane starts plummeting toward the ground. Frantically, the passengers search for parachutes, only to find there are 4 bags and 5 people. The social worker grabs a bag. "I deserve to live. I protect vulnerable children and support families in need." He jumps. The lawyer snatches another. "I deserve to live. I advocate for my clients with sharp wit and massive knowledge." He jumps. The doctor grabs the third. "I deserve to live. I save lives with my specialized training." He jumps. Now only the old man and the schoolboy remain. The old man sighs. "Go ahead, son. Take the last parachute. You have your whole life ahead of you. I'm just an old man." The boy grins. "Don't worry, sir. We both have parachutes." The old man blinks. "What? But those 3... The boy shrugs. "Remember the lawyer with the sharp wit and massive knowledge? He took my school backpack." At my first job, I worked in an orange juice factory, but I got canned. I just couldn't concentrate. Then I tried being a lumberjack, but I just couldn't hack it, so they gave me the axe. Next, I worked as a tailor, but I wasn't suited for it, mainly because it was a so-so job. I gave Starbucks a shot, but I got tired of the same old grind. Then I tried being a chef. I figured it would add spice to my life, but I just didn't have the time. I worked in a deli, but no matter how I sliced it, I just couldn't cut the mustard. My best job was as a musician, but I eventually found I wasn't noteworthy. I studied for years to become a doctor, but I didn't have any patience. Then I took a job in a shoe factory. I tried hard, but I just didn't fit in. I became a fisherman, but I couldn't survive on my net income. I got a job cleaning pools, but the work was just too draining. Then I worked at a gym, but apparently I wasn't fit for the job. After all that, I became a historian, until I realized there was no future in it. My last job was at a muffler factory, but that was just too exhausting. So I finally tried retirement, and I found I'm perfect for the job. 2 attorneys boarded a flight out of Seattle. One took the window seat, the other sat in the middle. Just before takeoff, a physician boarded and took the aisle seat next to them. He kicked off his shoes, wiggled his toes, and got comfortable. The attorney by the window said, "I think I'll get up and grab a Coke." The physician smiled. "No problem, I'll get it for you." As soon as he left, the first attorney picked up one of the doctor's shoes and spat in it. When the physician returned with the Coke, the second attorney said, "That looks good. I think I'll have one too." Again, the physician kindly went to fetch it. While he was gone, the second attorney grabbed the other shoe and spat in it. The doctor returned, handed over the Coke, and they all settled in for the flight. As the plane landed, the physician slipped his feet into his shoes and immediately knew what had happened. He sighed, shaking his head. "How long must this go on? This war between our professions? The hatred, the animosity, the spitting in shoes, and then the pissing in Cokes!" An elderly man suspected his wife was losing her hearing, so he called her doctor to schedule an appointment. The doctor suggested a simple test to get a better idea of the situation. "Here's what you do," said the doctor. "Start about 40 feet away from her, speaking in a normal tone. If she doesn't respond, move closer, step by step, until she hears you." That evening, as his wife was cooking in the kitchen, the husband thought he'd give the test a try. He stood 40 feet away in the living room and asked, "Honey, What's for dinner? No response. He moved to about 30 feet away. Honey, what's for dinner? Still no response. Now 20 feet away. Honey, what's for dinner? No response. He moved to the dining room only 10 feet away. Honey, what's for dinner? Still nothing. Finally, he stood right behind her and shouted, Honey, what's for dinner? She whirled around, furious, and yelled, Chicken, chicken. For the 5th time, we're having chicken. One day, Pete complained to his friend, My head really hurts. I guess I should see a doctor. His friend replied, Don't bother with that. There's a computer at the drugstore that can diagnose anything quicker and cheaper than a doctor. Just tell it your problem, give it a urine sample, and it'll diagnose you and tell you what to do about it. It only costs $20. Pete figured he had nothing to lose, so he filled a jar with a urine sample and went to the drugstore. He found the computer, poured in the sample, and deposited the $20. The computer made some noises, lights flashed, and then a small slip of paper popped out. It read, You have migraines. Take better care of yourself. Get more rest, drink plenty of fluids, and avoid bright lights, stress, and strain. See me again in 2 weeks. Impressed, Pete thought about how amazing this technology was and how it could revolutionize medical science. But then he wondered, could the computer be fooled? So Pete mixed together some tap water, a stool sample from his dog, urine samples from his wife and daughter, and even some oil from his car. He went back to the drugstore, located the computer, poured in the strange mix, and deposited his $20. He entered his complaint, I have a bad headache. The machine made its usual noises, flashed its lights, and printed out a new diagnosis. Your tap water has too much waste. Your dog has ringworms. Your teenage daughter is pregnant. Your wife has had 5 different lovers in the past 6 months. Also, your car needs a new radiator. And you wonder why you have a headache. Tim had a terrible accident at work. He fell through a floor tile and ripped off both of his ears. Disfigured, he settled with the company for a large sum of money and moved on. Tim decided to invest his money in a small but growing telecom business called Plexus Communications. After weeks of negotiations, he bought the company outright. But after signing the contract, he realized he had no idea how to run a business. So he set out to hire someone who did. The next day, he scheduled 3 interviews. The first candidate was excellent, very knowledgeable and engaging. At the end of the interview, Tim asked, Do you notice anything different about me? The man replied, Well, yes, I couldn't help but notice you have no ears. Tim got furious, threw him out, and moved on to the second interview. The second candidate was a woman, and she was even better than the first. Tim asked the same question. Do you notice anything different about me? She answered, You don't have any ears. Tim was livid again and tossed her out as well. The third interview was with a young man who had just graduated from college. He was smart, charming, and seemed to be a better businessman than the first 2 combined. Tim was eager, but asked the same question. Do you notice anything different about me? To his surprise, the young man replied, Yes. You wear contact lenses? Tim was stunned and asked, How did you know that? The young man burst into laughter, falling off his chair. Well, glasses would fall right off, wouldn't they? A senator is visiting a primary school. In one class, he asks the students if anyone can give him an example of a tragedy. One little boy stands up and says, If my best friend, who lives next door, is playing in the street and a car comes by and kills him, that would be a tragedy. No, the senator says. That would be an accident. A girl raises her hand. If a school bus carrying 50 children drove off a cliff, killing everyone inside, that would be a tragedy. I'm afraid not, explains the senator. That would be a great loss. The room falls silent. None of the other children dare to volunteer. What? The senator asks. Isn't there anyone here who could give me an example of a tragedy? Finally, little Johnny in the back timidly raises his hand. If an airplane carrying a senator was blown up by a bomb, that would be a tragedy. Marvelous, the senator beams. And can you tell me why that would be a tragedy? Well, says Johnny, because it wouldn't be an accident, and it certainly wouldn't be a great loss. One day, a police officer pulls over a car for speeding. He walks up to the window and immediately notices not just the red sports car, but also how gorgeous the driver is. Blue eyes, blonde hair, the works. I pulled you over for speeding, ma'am. Could I see your driver's license? What's a license? She replies, instantly revealing her lack of awareness. It's usually in your wallet, the officer says. After fumbling for a while, the driver finds it. Now, may I see your registration? The officer asks. Registration, what's that? She responds. It's usually in your glove compartment. More fumbling, and she eventually finds it. I'll be back in a minute, the officer says, and walks back to his patrol car. The officer calls dispatch to run a check on her license and registration. After a moment, the dispatcher says, is she driving a red sports car? Yes, the officer replies. Is she a drop-dead gorgeous blonde? Yes. Here's what you do, says the dispatcher. Give her the stuff back and drop your pants. What? I can't do that. It's inappropriate, the officer protests. Trust me, says the dispatcher with a grin in his voice. Just do it. So the cop walks back to the car, hands her the license and registration, and following the dispatcher's advice, drops his pants. The blonde looks down, sighs, and says, Oh no, not another breathalyzer. Just 6 days into their marriage, Sarah sat her husband Mike down for a serious talk. Her face was stern, and Mike could feel trouble brewing. Mike, she said firmly, I want a divorce. Mike's heart sank. A divorce? But why? What happened? I thought everything was going fine. Sarah huffed and crossed her arms. Look, I didn't marry you for this. For what? Mike asked, now completely confused. She leaned forward, glaring at him. I married you to start a family and have kids, not because I want to poop freely. Farmer Rick was in a car accident, and in court, the trucking company's lawyer was questioning him. Didn't you say at the moment of the accident, I'm fine? Asked the lawyer. Rick responded, Well, I'll tell you what happened. I had just loaded my favorite mule, Bessie, into the... I didn't ask for any details, the lawyer interrupted. Just answer the question. Did you not say at the scene of the accident, I'm fine? Rick replied, Well, I had just got Bessie into the trailer and was driving down the road. The lawyer interrupted again, exasperated. Judge, I'm trying to establish that this man told the highway patrolman he was fine at the scene. Now, weeks later, he's trying to sue my client. This is clearly a fraud. Tell him to answer the question. The judge, intrigued by the back and forth, turned to Rick. I'd like to hear what he has to say about his favorite mule, Bessie. Rick thanked the judge and continued. Well, as I was saying, I had just loaded Bessie, my favorite mule, into the trailer and was driving down the highway when this huge semi-truck ran the stop sign and smacked my truck right in the side. I was thrown into one ditch, and Bessie was thrown into the other. I was hurting real bad and didn't want to move, but I could hear old Bessie moaning and groaning. I knew she was in terrible shape just by her groans. When the highway patrolman arrived, he could hear her too. He went over to check on her, took one look, and saw she was near death. So he took out his rifle and shot her between the eyes. Then the patrolman came across the road, rifle still in hand, looked at me and asked, How are you feeling? Now what the heck would you say? A beautiful young model boards a flight to New York with a ticket for the economy section. She looks at the cramped seats in economy, then at the spacious first-class cabin, and decides to move up to the last empty seat in first class. The flight attendant politely checks her ticket and tells her that her seat is in economy. I'm a famous model, she replies. I've never had this problem before. I'm staying here until we get to New York. Flustered, the flight attendant goes to the cockpit and tells the captain. The captain returns and tells the woman that her seat is in economy. I'm a famous model. I'm sitting here all the way to New York, she insists. The captain, not wanting a scene, confides in the co-pilot, who says he can handle it. The co-pilot walks over, whispers something in the model's ear, and she immediately jumps up, hugs him, and rushes back to her seat in economy. The pilot and flight attendant ask the co-pilot what he said. I just told her the first-class seats aren't going to New York, he replies with a grin. 3 technicians go into an interview at a local telephone company. They're all well qualified, so the boss says, "I'm going to give you one day to impress me. Go out and set as many telephone poles as you can and report back tomorrow." The 3 technicians go to work and return the next day. The boss asks the first guy, "How many poles did you set?" 13. "Wow, 13, that's impressive," the boss says. The second guy replies, "I set 9. Not as many, but still impressive," the boss says. He turns to the third guy. "How many did you set?" The third guy with blonde hair waving in the wind proudly says, 2. 2? That's it?" the boss exclaims. "What were you doing all day?" The technician shrugs and says, "Well, I didn't want to be a snitch, but these other guys? They only put their poles halfway in the ground." Many years ago, 2 sisters, one blonde, one brunette, inherited the family ranch. Unfortunately, after a few years, they ran into financial trouble. To avoid losing the ranch, they decided to buy a bull to breed their own stock. They had only $600 left. The brunette tells her sister, "If I decide to buy the bull, I'll contact you to drive out and haul it home." The brunette heads to the stockyard, inspects a bull, and decides to buy it for $599. After paying, she realizes she has only $1 left. She heads to the nearest town to send a telegram to her sister. Walking into the telegraph office, she says, "I want to send a telegram to my sister telling her I've bought the bull. She needs to hitch the trailer to the truck and drive out here to help me haul it home." The operator informs her, "Sure, but it's 99 cents per word." With only $1, the brunette thinks for a moment and says, "Send her the word comfortable." The operator is confused. "How will your sister know what you want if you only send one word, comfortable?" The brunette replies, "My sister's blonde. The word's big. She'll read it slowly. Comfortable." 3 blondes find themselves standing before the heavenly gate. Each of them lived a sinful life full of excess, but despite this, they find themselves before St. Peter. After a moment of contemplation, St. Peter speaks. "Okay, ladies," he says, "the Lord has decided to show mercy and give you another chance. I'm going to ask each of you the same question. If you answer it correctly, you'll be granted entry into heaven. If you're wrong, you'll be sent to hell." St. Peter reminds them, "Each of you will be asked the same question, so the order in which you answer is important. Choose wisely who will answer first." The girls whisper among themselves, and the first blonde steps forward. "I'll answer first," she says confidently. St. Peter asks, "What is Easter?" The first blonde thinks for a moment, and then proudly responds, "It's when everyone decorates trees and gives each other presents." Saddened, Peter says, "I'm sorry, that's incorrect." A fiery pit opens, swallowing the first blonde whole. The second blonde steps up, ready to give it a try. Peter asks, "What is Easter?" With a smile, the second blonde answers, "That's the day everyone wears green, and if you don't, they pinch you." Peter sighs, "I'm afraid that's wrong too." The pit opens again, and the second blonde is swallowed. The third blonde steps forward, smiling brightly. Peter asks, "What is Easter?" The third blonde beams. "That's when Jesus was betrayed to the Romans, crucified by Pontius Pilate, and placed in a tomb sealed with a big stone." Peter, impressed, replies, "That's very close. But what happens next?" The blonde continues confidently. "The next day they move the stone, and if Jesus sees his shadow, we get 6 more weeks of winter." A blonde who lived with 2 other blonde roommates bought a brand new car. On her way home from the dealership, she got caught in a terrible hailstorm, and her car was dented all over. When she got home, she called the service department to ask what to do. They offered to send a mechanic, but she would have to pay for the service, and she had absolutely no money. Desperate, she asked if they could still help her. The service chief, being a prankster, told her, "Just wait until the car cools down, then blow as hard as you can into the tailpipe. That will pop out all the dents." A half hour later, her roommates walked in to find her on her knees behind the car, blowing into the tailpipe as hard as she could. They asked, "What on earth are you doing?" She looked up, confused, and said, "I'm trying to get the dents out, but it's not working." One of her blonde roommates rolled her eyes and said, "You dummy, you have to roll up the windows first." One day, Bob decided to visit the zoo. He walked up to the ape cage and found himself staring at a large male ape who was staring right back at him. Bob scratched his head, and the ape mirrored his actions. Intrigued, Bob decided to have some fun. He started scratching his underarms and jumping around while saying, "Oh, oh, oh," and sure enough, the ape copied him. Bob, thinking he could take it a step further, scratched his chin while pondering what to do next. But before he could react, the ape ripped the bars of the cage apart, leaped over the moat, and proceeded to beat him senseless. Weeks later, Bob woke up in a hospital room, completely immobilized with broken bones. As soon as the doctors realized he was awake, they brought a man into the room. "Mr. Smith, my name is Albert, and I'm the zookeeper. I need to understand what happened before the attack," the zookeeper said. Bob groaned, trying to remember. "I don't know. I was just looking at the ape, and I noticed he was copying me." Albert leaned forward. "What exactly did you do?" Bob replied, "Well, when I scratched my head, he did too, so I decided to mess around a bit. I scratched under my arms and made ooh sounds, and the ape did the same." Albert nodded, waiting for Bob to continue. "I was thinking of what to do next, and I think I scratched my chin," Bob said, cringing as the memory came back. Albert's eyes widened. "You scratched your chin?" He sighed in relief. "That explains everything. In ape language, scratching your chin means screw you." Thank goodness. If the attack had been unprovoked, we would have had to put him down. Bob sat there, recovering in the hospital for months, unable to move, frustrated by the constant care required for even the smallest things. The time dragged on, and during that period, Bob hatched a plan to get his revenge on the ape. Finally, after months of recovery, Bob marched into the local butcher's shop where he bought a giant Polish sausage and a pair of butcher knives. He then headed straight to the zoo. At the ape cage, Bob stared the ape down. "Remember me?" he asked, waiting for the ape to mimic him again. The ape mirrored his movements just as before. Bob smiled, reached into his bag, and tossed a butcher knife into the ape's cage. The ape eagerly grabbed it. Bob held his own knife high, pulled out the sausage from his pants, and waited. The ape copied his every move, holding the knife high and grabbing the sausage. Just as planned, Bob sliced the sausage in half with his butcher knife. With a smirk, he looked at the ape, expecting to see its pain and confusion. But when he looked up, he saw the ape standing there, scratching its chin. Jacob was sitting in the school hallway, bored out of his mind, when the teacher walked by. He called out to her, "How do you put an elephant in the fridge?" The teacher, amused, replied, "I don't know how." Jacob grinned and said, "You open the door and put it in there?" The teacher laughed, but Jacob wasn't done yet. He asked, "Okay, now how do you put a giraffe in the fridge?" Thinking she had this one figured out, the teacher answered, "Oh, you open the door and put it in there?" Jacob shook his head. "Nope. You open the door, take the elephant out, and then you put the giraffe in." The teacher was starting to get a bit confused, but Jacob wasn't finished yet. He asked, "All the animals went to the tiger's birthday party except one. Which one didn't go?" The teacher hesitated. The tiger?" Jacob shook his head with a smirk. "Nope, the giraffe. He's still in the fridge." Finally, Jacob asked one last question. "If there's a river full of crocodiles and you want to get across, how do you do it?" The teacher thought for a second and said, "Well, you would walk over the bridge." Jacob replied with a grin, "Nope, you swim across because all the crocodiles are at the tiger's birthday party." A massive, muscle-bound man with a tiny head walks into a bar and orders a beer. The bartender, eyeing him up, says, "I have to say, your physique is incredible. But why is your head so small?" The big guy sighs, clearly used to this question, and starts his story. "Well, I was out hunting one day and got lost in the woods. I heard someone calling for help, and it turned out to be a frog sitting by a stream. I picked it up, and it said, 'Kiss me, and I'll turn into a genie and grant you 3 wishes.' So I kissed the frog, and poof, It turned into a stunning, naked woman. She told me, "You have 3 wishes now?" I looked down at my scrawny body and said, "I want a body like Arnold Schwarzenegger's." She nodded, waved her hand, and poof, I was jacked, bursting out of my clothes. She asked, "What's your second wish?" I glanced at her, then at the stream, and said, "I want to make passionate love with you right here." She smiled, and we spent hours together in the wilderness. Afterward, as we lay there, still catching our breath, she whispered, "One wish left. What's it going to be?" I looked at her and said, "How about a little more head?"